Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Make Politics Boring Again. This week I'll be answering another 5 questions that have been sent in by you, the listeners, and if you want to send in your own questions for the next episode, you can get in touch at makepoliticsboringagain@hotmail.com. So the first question asks, is the Dark Enlightenment philosophy gaining traction among tech elites? This picks up from where we left off in the last episode, where we talked about how billionaires are no longer content with just buying influence over systems like digital currency and city governance. Instead, they now want to own these systems and create their own private cities. So the Dark Enlightenment philosophy helps them to justify that, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. The Dark Enlightenment is a political philosophy that was created by Curtis Yarvin. Now, you probably haven't heard of this guy, but he was a software developer and a far-right political blogger for a long time. But he's no longer just in the shadows writing about his own philosophy. He's now become a respected guest in elite spaces. So, for example, he's been speaking at Ivy League debates, and he's being praised by people like Peter Thiel, who's a billionaire venture capitalist, and he's the co-founder of Palantir and PayPal. People like Peter Thiel support bloggers and commentators like Curtis Yarvin because of their authoritarian views. As the name The Dark Enlightenment suggests, it is in direct opposition to the original Enlightenment from the 18th century, which promoted values like democracy and human rights. Yarvin sees these Enlightenment ideals as a mistake because he believes that democracy leads to chaos and decay, so he really wants to reverse it. He wants to see society being run like a private company where there's just one unelected executive at the top, there's no elections or debate, there's just control in the hands of the CEO. So what we're seeing right now in wider society is a shift of power from the public sector to the private sector. So we're moving from democratic systems to technocratic systems, which means that our infrastructures are becoming much more controlled. And this Dark Enlightenment philosophy has become a big part of that shift. So it's obvious why this philosophy is attractive to billionaires like Peter Thiel, because it's seen as removing the so-called messiness and the bureaucracy of public accountability while preserving the illusion of innovation and progress. And we're already seeing how this ideology plays out in real life, because we've seen how Elon Musk has turned X, formerly Twitter, into a private digital infrastructure where Musk and only Musk sets the rules. So, for example, your verification status now determines your visibility on the platform, and moderation has been replaced by personal command. So in some cases, whether you're banned from X or not almost comes entirely down to Elon Musk's personal decision. It's a combination now of a content platform, a political megaphone, and a behavioral lab, all rolled into one and controlled entirely by Elon Musk. In the last episode, we talked about another billionaire called Mark Law, whose proposal for his Telosa cities is being sold as a futuristic utopia, but the power structure in those cities would be based on the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, because it's proposing a privately owned city run by a management board, so there wouldn't be any elected leaders. There would be no local democracy and no legal oversight, so it'd be very difficult for citizens of those cities to actually complain about how the cities run or to make any changes at all. Like I said in the last episode, they'd either have to put up with it or leave. So Curtis Yarvin's idea of government as a private corporation run by a single executive overlaps perfectly with the real-world ambitions of people like Elon Musk and Mark Law. And on the surface, things like these Tolosa cities and the X platform may look like a billionaire's vanity project, but they're actually prototypes of post-democratic governance, where your rights are defined by the terms of service and not the law. So you have a lot less power and you are subject to a single person's decisions. But let's take a step back and look at this in the context of the big picture, because what we're seeing right now isn't the collapse of capitalism, even though many people say it is. This is actually the next phase, because late capitalism isn't broken. It was literally designed to work this way. That's why wages have flatlined while prices keep rising, and why housing costs more than most people can afford. And it's also why we're seeing our public services being stripped away and sold to the highest bidder. The richest people on the planet are making more money than ever off the back of this collapse. And that's exactly how the system is built, because it's built by the wealthy for the wealthy. Capitalism was built and designed to extract your time, your energy, and your basic needs and turn them into profit for someone else. So this is why the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing, and every election feels like theatre, it feels like a show, while our lives get harder no matter who's in charge. Because it is getting harder. That's not an appearance. It is getting tougher to survive. So the next stage after late capitalism will not be decided by public debate. We won't have a say in it. It's already being decided by the people with power. And that's not even the politicians, so we can't even vote for them because they're just the middle managers. The next stage will actually be decided by the billionaires, the CEOs, and the think tanks who are already sketching out the next system. Right now, we're living through a moment of ideological volatility, and this isn't because the public is being asked what kind of world they want, but because the social contract between the government and its citizens is breaking down, and the reality of our capitalist dictatorship that we currently live in is now becoming increasingly clear, with the wealthy elites stepping forward from the shadows to take the reins. During this transition, there will be philosophies and ideologies competing to replace the current ones, but which one wins won't depend on what's fair or just or includes the most freedom for the citizens. It will come down purely to which model the ruling class sees as the best tool for preserving their control. And the Dark Enlightenment philosophy fits that need perfectly, and it's not some fringe blog post anymore, it's being backed by billionaires, which has made it a ready-made ideology for post-democratic rule, because it will strip away the illusion of public consent and hand power over to the highest bidder. What makes the Dark Enlightenment so dangerous is how well it fits into the existing architecture of elite power, because it offers a ready-made ideology for these wealthy elites to use in order to justify their actions. So now the billionaires are looking to take the reins. We're going to start seeing tech CEOs become heads of state and AI replacing democratic decision-making, while private companies control the design of cities and energy infrastructure. And on top of all of that, media platforms are going to be rebuilt as loyalty filters. So none of this is being done by accident, and the Dark Enlightenment provides a theoretical backbone for a system that is already drifting towards total private governance. So the next question asks, is the rise of Techno-Fascism in America a new form of authoritarianism? So we've just discussed the growing influence of the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, which is an ideology that openly rejects democracy in favour of rule by unelected technocrats. But this shift isn't happening in theory alone, it's already being built into policy through initiatives like Project 2025 and experimental structures like the now defunct Department of Government Efficiency, otherwise known as DOGE. If you haven't already heard of Project 2025, it was developed by the Heritage Foundation, and it's a plan to restructure the whole of the US federal government by concentrating power in the executive branch. The Project 2025 plan contains a number of proposals, including the replacing of tens of thousands of civil servants with political appointees that are loyal to the president. And it also proposes dismantling oversight bodies and weakening regulatory protections, so the president will have even more free rein to do whatever he wants. Its goal is to remove obstacles to fast top-down control, and this is essentially a legal framework for authoritarianism because it removes the checks and balances in favour of a centralised rule. So if we look at the Doge department as one example of this plan, it was launched as a parallel experiment in government efficiency, and the department was headed up by Elon Musk for 130 days before his resignation on May the 28th. Doge aimed to bring a Silicon Valley mentality to the White House. So in the same way that startups aim to disrupt industries, Elon Musk wanted to disrupt the way that government worked. In practice, it's the fusion of corporate power with state functions, and it's what I see as being the endpoint of neoliberalism that was introduced by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan when they began deregulating the private sector in the first place. The Doge department used tools like AI and automation to streamline public services and supposedly cut costs and centralize the decision making. Some savings were reported, but the department quickly became a symbol of chaos, legal battles, and unaccountable tech dominance. Now that Musk is gone, the future of Doge is uncertain, but the model it introduced has not disappeared. This convergence of centralized executive power and unregulated technological control is called Techno-Fascism. It's a 21st century form of authoritarianism where control is automated, decentralized, and often invisible. It doesn't necessarily rely on military force or mass arrests. It relies more so on algorithmic surveillance through digital platforms and things like predictive governance tools. So public dissent and protests won't necessarily be outlawed, but they will be deranked by algorithms. So you continue to feel isolated and like no one else feels the same way as you. No one is as scared as you are. This is going to become more and more powerful as we live more and more through our phone screens, because the algorithm controls our view of the world, and solidarity amongst citizens becomes almost impossible. So protest isn't crushed necessarily, it's just buried by content moderation, and it's flagged by artificial intelligence or financially throttled by deplatforming. So what this means in practice is that if you start tweeting or making videos on YouTube or Instagram about a protest that is going on, it can be demonetized, it can be hidden from public view by the algorithm, and you could have your account removed entirely to keep you quiet and to remove your online voice. Project 2025, which we talked about earlier, provides the legal scaffolding for all of this, and Doge, or whatever replaces it, provides the technological execution. So when those two are combined, they represent a shift towards governance that is optimized for elite control, because it's fast, it's frictionless, and it's shielded from public input. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's not speculation. We're already seeing it being put into practice in the form of biometric border controls and facial recognition, which is being rolled out without consent from the public. There's also things like predictive policing software, which disproportionately targets poor and minority communities. We're also seeing AI-driven content moderation and algorithmic censorship deciding what information is allowed to circulate online. So this means that corporate platforms like X, Meta, and YouTube act as unelected gatekeepers of public discourse. So techno-fascism doesn't announce itself, it just arrives baked into the code that creates the algorithms dictating what we see online, and it's hidden in terms of service and justified by supposedly being more efficient. So what we're now facing is not the 1930s model of authoritarianism, but a version that is more suited to the modern digital age. Question 3 of this episode asks, is the global crackdown on digital speech a threat to democracy? So now we've explored the rise of techno-fascism and how democratic institutions are being eroded, not necessarily through military coups, but through technological control. That theme continues here as we look a bit closer at a growing global trend of governments imposing restrictions on digital speech. Now, these moves are often justified as efforts to protect democracy, children, or public safety, but they also raise concerns about censorship and the quiet suppression of dissent. In August last year, Brazil's Supreme Court ordered the suspension of X or Twitter after the platform refused to block accounts that were accused of spreading disinformation and failed to appoint a local legal representative to liaise with the government. The court framed their decision as being necessary to defend democracy, but over 20 million users lost access overnight. Now, President Lula supported the decision and accused Elon Musk of promoting a far-right free-for-all, arguing that even billionaires must follow the law, but this can clearly be seen as judicial overreach and setting a very dangerous precedent, because the public had no say in this decision. It wasn't debated in Parliament or put to a vote, it was imposed on them from above in the name of democracy, but without any democratic input. What makes this case so interesting, for me anyway, is that it came from a left-wing government using the same justifications often seen in authoritarian regimes, because it was claiming to fight hate speech and preserve public order. But when those justifications are used to shut down a major communication platform without the public having any say in it whatsoever, it shows democracy for the sham that it tends to be under a capitalist system. After a month-long standoff, Twitter or X complied by paying the fines and appointing a representative, so the ban was lifted, but the precedent still remains. And this case showed how quickly any government, whether it's left or right, can resort to censorship when digital platforms threaten their power. If the public had voted for it to be banned, it would have been a democratic decision and difficult to argue against, but it wasn't. The UK has taken a different path with the Online Safety Act. I won't go into too much detail about it because I've gone in depth on the Act on previous episodes, but basically it's being sold as making the internet safer and protecting children, which is a pretty standard excuse for any government that wants to bring in tighter surveillance measures. So the Online Safety Act requires platforms to do 3 things in particular: remove illegal content, reduce access to harmful material, and be held legally responsible for what happens on their websites. Now, there's 3 immediate issues that I see with this. Firstly, the government decides what constitutes illegal content, and the public typically doesn't get a vote on that. Secondly, harmful material is an incredibly vague term and can be used to block any political content. And thirdly, the threat of being held legally responsible tends to be just a formality and for public posturing, because the government needs social media sites on their side and under their control. So legal repercussions are quite unlikely, not severe repercussions anyway. So while this might be presented to the public as a child protection measure, it actually opens the door to quite serious overreach. One of the most controversial provisions allows the government regulator Ofcom to compel companies to scan encrypted messages, which would completely undermine end-to-end encryption, which is one of the few tools that protect people like whistleblowers and activists. Signal and WhatsApp, which are two major messaging apps, have already threatened to pull out of the UK market rather than comply with these new rules. And many civil liberty groups argue that this is not about safety at all, it's about mass surveillance. It shifts power from users and platforms to regulators, and it allows the state to intervene directly in how we communicate, even in our private conversations. So the moment you create that kind of infrastructure, it won't just be used to protect children, it's going to be used to manage politics. And the final example is the European Union, which is making similar moves with its Digital Services Act. This act places legal obligations on platforms to remove illegal content and to be more transparent about how they moderate speech. This is intended as part of a broader effort to bring big tech under democratic control. But even here, there are massive risks. So like I said before with the UK's Act, this Act gives the state enormous power to determine what counts as harmful or illegal, and these terms are often vague, they're open to manipulation, and they're politically loaded. Under this Act, platforms are being incentivized to remove content preemptively to avoid fines or any reputational damage, which can then result in over-censorship and the silencing of controversial but completely legitimate political discourse. It's the same technocratic solution that every government seems to be moving towards, but it just allows the government to decide what can be said and what must be hidden, so the space for democratic debate is steadily shrinking. So yes, there is a global crackdown on digital speech, and it doesn't matter that it's just online, because the internet is now where democracy happens. Public discourse, political organising, investigative journalism, and protest movements all begin and circulate through digital platforms. So when governments tighten their control over those platforms, they're not just moderating content anymore, they're reshaping the boundaries of public life. And it's not always being done in an obvious, aggressive way, like having a boot on someone's neck. It's being done through a terms of service violation or being flagged by AI. And through laws like we've talked about here that are being written supposedly in the name of safety. But the effect is exactly the same because it controls what can be said and who gets to speak. The most dangerous part of these acts is how easy they are to justify, because all of us want to stop misinformation and to protect children. But these types of laws only normalise the amount of control the state has over our speech. It's a system that future governments will inherit, and there's no guarantee they'll be as benevolent as the ones writing the laws today. If you remove freedom of expression in order to protect democracy, you're not protecting democracy at all. You're redefining it and placing more limits on it so that it can be more manageable and easier to control. On the surface, this issue might seem like it's about whether we agree with the speech being restricted, but it's actually much, much bigger than that. It's about whether we're willing to accept a government having the power to control what we say and what we think. This isn't hypothetical. It's happening right now, and it's only going to get worse unless we start to push back by protesting and by using other means of communication, like encrypted messaging apps, VPNs, and using social media platforms that aren't controlled by billionaires or government officials. So we're going to take a short break now, and just a reminder, you can send in your own questions for the next episode via Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain, or you can email us at makepoliticsboringagain@hotmail.com.
Please
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.
Welcome back. So, the first of our final two questions of this episode asks, is the Digital Fairness Act a genuine effort to protect consumers or simply a tool for control? Before the break, we talked about the EU and their Digital Services Act, and now we're going to talk about the Digital Fairness Act that they're introducing. This act is being promoted as an update to consumer protections for the digital age by targeting manipulative practices and what's known as dark patterns, things like addictive app design, undisclosed influencer marketing, and hyper-targeted behavioural advertising. These are framed as threats to user autonomy by exploiting psychology and undermining informed consent. So to counter these techniques, the Act's enforcement will require increased monitoring of user activity and their platform behaviour. All of these increase the amount of state and corporate surveillance into our personal and private lives. It's also going to punish small businesses and startups who may not be able to afford to implement the technologies required for compliance with the law. So whereas large corporations can afford the added bureaucracy, and they also have the power to influence the rules to their advantage, so this results in a two-tier system where tech giants tighten their grip on the industry while appearing to support ethical reform. Policies like this only help to consolidate power in the hands of the elites. If enforcement mechanisms rely on deeper access to user data and platform systems, that creates an incentive structure where both the state and corporate actors gain more visibility into our lives, so their control expands under the banner of fairness. The Digital Fairness Act is unlikely to be a genuine effort to protect consumers. It fits a broader pattern where laws are marketed as protective but end up reinforcing the dominance of those who already control the digital landscape. The real test, as always, is not in the language of the law, but in its implementation. So we always need to be aware of who the law protects, who it burdens, and who gets to define what fairness really means. So now we come to the last question of this episode. I just want to thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you subscribe, and if you could leave a review on whichever platform you're listening to this through, I would really appreciate it. And if you want to send in your question for the next episode, you can get in touch through Instagram at makepoliticsboringagain, or you can drop us an email at makepoliticsboringagain@hotmail.com. So the final question of this episode is a bit more positive than the previous questions, and it asks, are May Day protests signalling a new era of worker solidarity? So this refers to the protests on May the 1st this year in the United States especially, which saw one of the largest May Day mobilizations in recent history. It was part of the May Day Strong movement, where hundreds of thousands of workers, immigrants, educators, and activists took to the streets in over 1,000 cities and towns across the country. The protests were organised by a coalition of more than 150 grassroots groups against a range of recent policies that are aggressively pro-business and anti-worker, like the dismantling of labour protections, the attacks on public sector unions, and the increasing privatisation of services like education and healthcare. These issues were part of a broader movement that links workers' rights to climate justice, immigrant rights, healthcare access, and racial justice. We saw slogans like "One struggle, one fight, all workers unite," which reflected this intersectional approach. We saw immigrants, teachers, nurses, and climate activists all marching together and demanding not just better pay or conditions, but a more equitable social contract. So this protest movement runs more widely and more deeply than perhaps other previous movements have. But does this mean that we are witnessing the emergence of class consciousness in the Western world? We've seen recent books and comments from mainstream leftist commentators saying that the culture war has been used to fragment the working class and keep us all isolated as individuals, which I believe that many people are already aware of. But these May Day protests suggest that more people are starting to now reject that culture war. So movements like 5051 signal a potential shift away from identity-based division and towards solidarity that is grounded in the shared material conditions of the workers. But this also comes with its own problems, because for decades, many minority communities have had to fight alone for their civil and political rights, and they're often sidelined or tokenized in larger workers' movements. So does this now mean that they have to put those struggles on hold in the name of class unity, or are we finally seeing a more mature labour movement emerge? Because we need one that doesn't demand purity or some hierarchy of oppression. We need a labour movement which understands that economic justice and social justice are inseparable. The 2025 May Day protests didn't answer these questions, but they did pose them, and in doing so, they marked the beginning of something new. A labour movement that looks less like a single cause and more like a coalition of interconnected fights. If that coalition holds strong, it could be the foundation of a serious challenge to the power of the wealthy elites. So that's all we have time for this week, but thank you once again for listening, and I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Please feel free to like and subscribe wherever you're listening to this, and as always, feel free to send in your questions for the next episode. So thank you for listening, look after each other, and see you next time.
Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again. Make politics boring again.